budget. But of concern is that even before the budget is read, there are plans by the Ministry of Treasury to increase more taxes, and this will definitely affect the price of basic commodities. And when I'm talking about the basic commodities here, I'm not only talking about the price of bread and gas when it comes to taxes, but also taxes to the common mwananchi who's also trying to make all ends meet when it comes to the transport sector. Border operators will also be affected by the new tax proposals that Authoritative, the CS for Treasury, is planning to put in place as it reads the budget as a way of raising more funds for funding the 2021-2022 fiscal year budget. So let me bring in Victor Otieno, a tax expert, joining us this morning on KTN News Center, just to pique his mind on what this means to the entire country. And Victor, definitely, this is not a good news for Kenyans. You know, hard economic times, Kenyans are trying to tighten their belts. Here we have high fuel prices. Then again comes the government through the Minister of Treasury, CS Authoritative, saying, you know what? The prices of basic commodities are yet. Expect the price of basic commodity to go up. But the question in the minds of many Kenyans, does the government really care?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Brenda. I think it's a very sad state for, the common mwananchi in terms of, of course, basic prices going up. But I think more broadly, the question that we should be asking ourselves is the strategic goals that the National Treasury has in the budget in terms of programs that its plans to institute to, shelve the private sector and the small medium enterprises in Kenya. And of course, if that can be looked at from the budget policy statement, which was, which went through according to the Public Finance Management Act 2012, went for approval to Cabinet as well as National Assembly, I think by the 15th of February. So if you look at the budget policy statement, there are two key thematic areas that National Treasury wants to address through the budget. Number one is the Big Four, and number two is the post-COVID-19 economic strategy. So these are the two themes or the two areas that we need to really question on the veracity, so that is how the money is going to be spent. So that even if we have short-term pain in terms of tax being raised, but on the demand side, are the strategies being put under the budget policy statement making sense, and would they have the kind of impact that is expected for economic recovery of the country? But
then how can the government try to ensure that it brings some balance? Yes, it's talking about raising taxes as a way of, trying to raise funds to fund the budget for the fiscal year of 2021-2022. So how can it, try to bring the balance in such a way that as much as you're raising tax, Kenyans won't feel the effect when it comes to the basic commodities in terms of pricing?
Yeah, so I think it's a chicken and egg situation in the sense that, of course, government over the last 5 years has been grappling with debt, and this is just a byproduct of the government trying to adjust its revenue model to be able to maybe based on requirements by, for example, institutions such as IMF. So this is a form of restructuring to ensure that it's able to raise enough money to be able to repay its debt. And I think from that end, it's very difficult. I think government is between a hard place and a rock. And for me, the question is, out of the money that is being raised by government, and that will be articulated under the budget, how best is the money being used to ensure that, for lack of a better word, we get a return on investment, so that the money is being put in places where we can be able to support private sector activities and SMEs to recover. And if you focus on the post-COVID-19 economic recovery strategy, there are 4 things that have been raised under the budget policy statement. Number one is supporting MSMEs, and they are doing that. They propose to do that through the credit guarantee scheme, supporting SMEs in terms of capacity building and onboarding SMEs to ICT platforms. That's number one. Number two is investment in ICT and digital infrastructure. Number 3 is the economic stimulus program, which again, there are still questions that linger there because we saw that, during in January, government pulled back some of those some of those programs. So again, that has to be put in questions. And lastly is the support of manufacturers through development of special economic zones. Again, the model that is being applied in development of special economic zones has to be questioned to see that the money that is being put under the budget is able to give the most impact in terms of a return to the economy.
But then, you know, Ms. Otieno, as the government, in a bid to raise more revenue in President Uhuru Kenyatta's final fiscal year in office, of concern is they're not only targeting the basic commodities, but also Kenyans trying to earn a living within the transport sector, border operators, because you know, that is one of the sectors that will also be affected, because as far as the price of a motorcycle is concerned here in the country, as we're speaking right now, the Exchequer has made a submission to amend the Excise Tax Act by replacing the excise duty paid per unit from about 11,000, if I'm not wrong, 608 shillings, correct me if I'm wrong, to a flat rate of 15%. So that means, as we speak right now, the price of any motorcycle above 79,000 would attract more taxes in what would deal a big blow. Actually, this would be a big blow to the border sector.
Yeah, so again, that's very unfortunate. And the sector, the transport and logistics sector, was one of the sectors, or is one of the sectors that has proved to be resilient during this pandemic. And I think, of course, maybe government has realized that this is a sector that they can be able to tax. Again, it employs a majority of our young people, so raising tax around the same, I think, is ill-advised. But I think more broadly, of course, we've seen government really take a huge chunk around petroleum, which I think we have 50% of the petrol that we pay goes to government in terms of taxes. So I think it's a chicken and egg situation. I might not want to be in the position of the CS in National Treasury, because again, they're trying to really restructure the revenue to be able to meet the requirements of the different financial institutions. And I think for me is if we can look at the short term, if we can be able to raise tax in the short term, but use that revenue in a manner that can be able to, spur private sector development, then for me that might be a better solution. Because if we focus on raising taxes and say, okay, now let's stop that, then probably government might be in a difficult situation. So for me, again, the emphasis is around getting a good return, taking projects that can be able to give a pragmatic return back to MSMEs and private sector in Kenya.
So what do you think happened to expanding the tax bracket? Because this is something the government has been talking about every year, and bringing in the informal settlement sector. The informal sector, like the Juakali sector, that is not even in the tax bracket. Yet they make millions, actually billions of shillings every year.
Yeah, so of course that's a very important conversation to have in terms of how do you bring in the 79% informal sector players in the MSME sector. And the question is that for me the question would be, what kind of incentives do you put to them to ensure that they can be able to be formalized? Because again, if you look at the cost of formalization for a lot of businesses is too high. So, of course, the only option they have is to remain informal for them to be able to break even. If you look at, for instance, data on Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, we have a death rate of over 75% of businesses closing within the first 3 years. So in as much as in these sectors or SMEs are contributing to the economic development of the country, they still face a lot of challenges. They have a very high mortality rate. And we can't just have an instant switch from informal to formal. So there has to be broader conversations around how to incentivize them, to help them grow, then probably move them to the formal sector and start taxing them. Right. Without that, you are basically taxing a dead horse.
Right. Mr. Chino, I know you can't see what's the ID that we've put on our screen, but our viewers can see it. It's taxing mwananchi. And, when I look at that ID, it's all about what runs into my mind is what Kenyans have been having, conversations they've been having within the streets of the country, of Nairobi, different parts of the country. And they're saying that it's reached a point where the country is becoming a taxing nation. Everything is being taxed. So now you're introducing more taxes that will affect basic commodity, products. Recently, the government was talking about taxing, the YouTube influencers, talking about taxing bringing tax, putting tax within the Airbnb sector. And then now the government is also talking about, removing, dropping from the list of products exempted from VAT. We're talking about medical materials. So clearly, even when you're going for medical treatment, come June, things will be very tough for Kenyans.
Yeah, I agree. We are in a very difficult situation, and I sympathize, from where I sit, I sympathize both with the common mwananchi, such as myself and the rest, as well as the dilemma that maybe the budget making process stakeholders are facing. So for me, again, I think the important call that we should be calling out on government is how the revenue that they are raising, how well it's being used to spur, economic recovery. And I think that's the major question that I would still ask.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about, we shift our focus, Mr. Tieno, to what the CS wants to do, what he's planning to do. He wants to amend the value-added tax, that is the VAT, without the approval of the members of parliament. Why do you think the CS wants to do that? Is it because he fears MPs will actually resist?
Yeah, so I think the law is very clear in terms of budget making process in Kenya. And this is articulated under the Section 25 of the Public Finance Management Act 2012, where the Cabinet Secretary of National Treasury shall present a budget policy statement for approval to cabinet, and subsequently the same is submitted to Parliament for debate and either approval or giving of suggestions of amendments. And I think that process is very clear. Maybe the approach he's taking, maybe he is might be referring to a different law, but I think the budget making process is very clear, and any amendments or any plan to raise revenue in whatever form and nature must go through cabinet approval as well as Parliament.
All right. So, Mr. Tieno, do you think we can amend our tax regime? And when I'm asking this question, I'm trying to put it into connection, or compare it with Singapore and US, where the tax regime can be predicted. It's predictable, where you know that probably this year, this is the tax that the government is going to introduce on this product, or probably the government might not, introduce more taxes to the citizens. Are we in a position as a country to probably try and copy that style, in terms of taxes?
I think, number one, the challenge I think that government has faced over the last 5 years has been around, managing its debt, and the challenges that are there in terms of usage of the funds that they raise, with the leakages around corruption, challenges with IFMIS, etc. So I think that from a supply side, that's the challenge that government is facing. On the demand side, I think the challenge that we also are facing as a country is the efficacy or veracity of how we invest the money that we receive as a country. And I think that's a question that we need to probe, and especially the budget policy statement, which, like I said, is the strategic priorities and goals that government uses in its budget making process. So before they assign a certain amount of money to a particular development or a particular sector, there is a strategy that they use, which is the budget policy statement. And for me, the question is the veracity of the choices that government makes in terms of investment in different sectors. So I think over time we can be able to achieve that, but unless we put our act together in the sense that blocking corruption loopholes and wastage and other kinds of wastage, then I think that might be a pipe dream in terms of getting predictability in the tax regime. And
you've brought in a very important point as we wind up this conversation, in terms of the government bringing a stoppage to misuse of public funds and also, corruption. But then, previously, Mr. Tieno, I know, being a tax expert, you're knowledgeable about this. Recently the IMF the International Monetary Fund had set out conditions that Kenya would have to implement following the approval of the 255 billion loan that Kenyans were raising concern about. And some conditions were set out, telling the government, live within your budget. Is now raising these taxes as a way of trying to live within our budget?
Yeah, so I think the challenge we've had, I think, with government for the last 5 years has been that exactly just wastage or suboptimal investment in the public sector. And I think, you know, they have reached a point where, you know, their back is on the wall, and the government has to put its house in order, in the sense that money that is raised, number one, is invested in sectors or areas that can give the best possible return, and number two, that the funds that have been allocated are well spent and there is no wastage. So I think, like I mentioned, the conditions are, of course, if any donor or any investor who wants to put in money elsewhere, they need surety that you can be able to repay their debt. So some of these measures that we are seeing is just a reaction of government based on the conditions that have been set by IMF, as well as you know, other different financial institutions, to ensure that, you know, there's fiscal discipline in terms of the way government, you know, is able to raise funds internally in the country.
Thank you so much, Mr. Victor Chien, a tax expert right there, talking to us about, you know, that proposal presented to Parliament by CS Ukuri Atani.